Yavani. I am a Wilma Mankiller Fellow with the National Congress of American Indians. On behalf of Absentee, I would like to thank you to this presentation on tools for election protection. Before we begin this presentation, I'd like to go over some of our webinar features. First, you should see on your screen the PowerPoint for today's presentation. If during the presentation you see any lag in slide transition, it may be a result of internet connection, so just give it a few extra seconds to update on your screen. Currently, with the exception of panelists, all audience phone lines are muted until the conclusion of the presentation. But if you would like to ask a question, you can type it in the questions box on your webinar control panel, which is located here in the red box. Also, if you would like to ask a question over the phone, we will unmute your line, and you would just need to raise your hand, and this is highlighted in the red box. Our webinar software archives all questions submitted through the questions box. So if we are unable to answer or address your questions, we will follow up with you after the webinar has concluded. This webinar is being recorded so that we can share this presentation with you and others not able to attend. Now that we've covered some of our webinar features, I would like to pass the presentation over to Peter Moore.
Thanks, Stacy, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on what part of the country you're in. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this special coordinator webinar focused on election protection issues. As you all know, for those of you who've been engaged in Native Vote over the last several months, there are several voter protection issues, both ongoing challenges that we're working on, as well as new and emerging opportunities, as well as challenges in some of the areas that our panelists will be talking about today. With just now starting to count the number of weeks until Election Day in 2014, it's the ideal time for us to be having this conversation. And we're really delighted to be joined both by a national partner in the Brennan Center, as well as leading Indian country experts from 4 Directions on this particular issue, and to give advice and direction as we develop our strategies. So I'm not going to take up much more of your time. We'll have a few more updates about where the Native Vote campaign is at, some information about the status of community grants and other things coming up after the presentation. But at this stage, I would love to introduce Jennifer Clark, who's with the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center is a recognized national leader on issues, on a range of issues, including issues around voter protection. So it's a pleasure to have Jennifer here to share with us, and I'll turn it over to her and she can introduce herself a little more, and she has some slides to share with you. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. As you mentioned, I am an attorney at the Brennan Center for Justice, and I'm here today to talk about the state of voting in 2014 and what voters can expect when they go to the polls this November. I think my slides are, I believe, in the process of loading right now, so give me 1 second and I will make sure that everybody can see. So I think it should be up now. If anyone has any problems, please just interrupt me and let me know. So just a little bit of background on who and what the Brennan Center for Justice is for any of you guys who aren't familiar with us. We are based at NYU Law School, although we do work nationwide, both at the state and federal level. Substantively, the Brennan Center focuses on protecting and furthering democracy and justice. I'm an attorney in our Voting Rights and Elections group, and that group works both to defend the right to vote and also to champion affirmative efforts to make elections more free, fair, and accessible for all eligible voters. From a strategic standpoint, we have a 4-part model that we use when we're trying to protect democracy and justice. We are part think tank, part advocacy group, part public interest law firm, and part communications hub. So those are the tools that we try to bring to the table when we are working with our coalition partners. In our role as a think tank, the Brennan Center issued a report earlier this summer looking at what voters will face when they go to the polls this November, as compared to the last time we all went to the polls for a midterm election in 2010. And our report made 4 key findings that I'll give a quick overview of now, and that I'll will serve as the basis for my presentation here today. The first finding is that since the 2010 election, there are new voting restrictions going to be in place in 22 states. So in 22 states, it will be harder to vote than it was in 2010. In 15 of those states, 2014 will be the first major election with these new restrictions in place. We also will need to watch the courts and look at what's happening in lawsuits. We are guessing that courts will play a crucial role before this November's elections because there are ongoing suits challenging laws in 7 states right now. And it's not all bad. Our report found some good news as well, which is that it will actually be easier to vote, and there have been voter-friendly laws passed in 16 states in the past couple of years as well. So starting with the 22 new states that have laws restricting the right to vote, what kind of trends or patterns emerge when we're looking at which states pass these laws? First is the question of partisanship. Our report found that of the 22 states with new voter restrictions in place, 18 of those passed entirely through Republican-controlled bodies. So the state legislature was controlled by Republicans and there was a Republican governor. Our finding is corroborated by external research. There's a recent study from the University of Massachusetts in Boston that found that restrictions on voting were more likely to pass as the proportion of Republicans in the legislature increased, or when a Republican governor was elected into office. So one of the emerging trends we see in the states that passed restrictive laws is the question of partisanship. Another trend that we saw was race and turnout among minority voters. Of the 11 states with the highest African American turnout in 2008, 7 of those 11 states have new voter restrictions in place for this election. And of the 12 states with the largest Hispanic population growth between 2000 and 2010, 9 of those 12 states passed laws making it harder to vote. That University of Massachusetts study I was just talking about also made a similar finding, and they determined that states with higher minority turnout were more likely to pass restrictive voting laws. So race and partisanship certainly play a role in where we can find new laws restricting the right to vote. So when I'm talking about laws that make it harder to vote, I just want to give a brief overview of the type of laws that I'm talking about. I'm sure many of you have heard about voter ID laws, particularly these strict photo ID laws, and those have been quite popular recently. Many states have passed restrictive voter ID laws. Some states have passed laws that make voter registration harder. Sometimes that means at the individual level, requiring voters to do more when they try to register to vote. And sometimes that means making it harder for community groups to run voter registration drives. There have also been cutbacks on early voting, and there have been laws that make it harder for people with past criminal convictions to get the right to vote back. So that's kind of the universe of laws that I'm talking about when I talk about restrictive laws. So you can see that there's a lot at stake in the coming election because legislators keep trying to get these restrictive laws passed and keep trying to make it harder for people to cast a vote that counts. I wanted to highlight a few new voting restrictions that could have a particular effect on Native communities around the country this November. The first is a new voting restriction in Montana. Montana was one of the first states to implement Election Day registration, meaning that you could show up on Election Day, and even if you hadn't registered yet, you would be able to cast a ballot. This past year, the legislature in Montana attempted to repeal Election Day registration. The governor of Montana actually vetoed that, but this November, that will be a ballot question. So when voters go to the polls this November, they'll be able to vote to either repeal or maintain Election Day registration in that state. There's also a voting restriction that I wanted to highlight in Arizona. Arizona has a new requirement that voters show documentary proof of citizenship when they register to vote. Around the country, you have to sign an affirmation claiming that you are an eligible voter, but Arizona is requiring people to show actual physical proof of citizenship, things like a passport or a birth certificate, different things like that. So that is a new restriction that's in place in Arizona, and that could affect a lot of voters who are perfectly eligible to vote but don't have the documents that are required. I also wanted to draw your attention to a new restrictive law that was passed in North Dakota. North Dakota has recently implemented a strict voter ID requirement. It's actually not entirely a photo ID requirement, because there are a couple types of identification that you can use there that don't have a photo ID, so it's not as bad as some other states, but it is still a significant ramping up of ID requirements as compared to prior elections in that state. And finally, I wanted to draw your attention to a new restriction in South Dakota that was passed in 2012, and that is a restriction that actually makes it more difficult for people with past criminal convictions to have the right to vote restored. So as you can see, there are a lot of new restrictions that as a group that's engaged with voters and that cares about how easy or difficult it is for voters to get to the polls, these are restrictions to watch out for and to be aware of in advance of this November's election. As I mentioned before, in 22 states passed restrictive laws. In 15 of those states, this is going to be the first election in which those new restrictive laws are in place. So this leads to a lot of confusion on Election Day, and that's certainly something, if you're going to be at the polls and monitoring, that's something to be aware of and watch out for. Everyone saw the long lines coverage in places like Florida. I'm sure that you've been aware that in Pennsylvania, for example, they recently passed a voter ID law that then got struck down. And so it's not in force, but voters were going to the polls in elections and were being asked to show ID, even though it wasn't required. So there's confusion around the laws, there's misimplementation of the laws, and that is something that we are all worried about as this election approaches, that these new laws will not even be implemented in the way that they're supposed to be implemented. So really the bottom line is that there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding the elections as voters go to the polls this November. And we are looking to the courts to see if they will resolve some of that uncertainty. New restrictions on voting are currently being challenged in court in 7 states. And there's also a lawsuit in Iowa, as you can see highlighted in light blue there, about a voter purge, taking people off the rolls. Before the 2012 election, courts actually stepped in and blocked new restrictions in 7 states. So we already know from experience that courts can play a huge role in what voters actually experience when they go to vote. So we need to watch the courts in the next 2 to 3 months before Election Day to see what happens. We've had a win in Pennsylvania. Like I mentioned, their photo ID law was struck down. We had a win in Ohio, where some days of early voting were restored. There's also been a good decision recently in Arkansas, where their strict photo ID law was struck down. That's currently being appealed, so we still have to wait and see what happens before November on that one. It's been kind of a mixed bag in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is another state that passed a strict photo ID law, and one court in Wisconsin has said that that law can't stand, that it's unconstitutional. Another court in Wisconsin has said that it's perfectly fine and that it can be implemented. So decisions are being appealed right now, and we'll probably have a final decision before November. So Wisconsin is definitely a state to watch. Unfortunately, voting advocates suffered a big loss in North Carolina recently. Last summer, North Carolina passed a very, very horrible, wide-reaching elections law that basically runs the gamut in terms of bad things that it does. It cuts same-day registration. It rolled back early voting opportunities. It implemented a strict photo ID requirement for future elections and a host of other bad restrictions. And the groups that are challenging that law asked the court to basically put a hold on the law before this November's election, because there isn't a trial scheduled until far in the future, but they wanted to stop it from going into effect before November, and the court said no. So there's going to be a host of new restrictions in place in North Carolina. We're also watching for decisions in Texas and in Arizona, so definitely keep your eye on the courts. I wanted to draw your attention in particular to some lawsuits that are taking place around the country right now that have the potential to have a particular effect on voters from Native communities. The first one is a language access lawsuit in Alaska. A group of Alaska Native voters are suing the state of Alaska, claiming that the state has routinely failed to provide adequate language access to Alaska Native voters who live in limited English proficient population areas. So when they go to the polls, there isn't any information that they can read. They're basically voting blind. A trial was held in July, and the federal government has actually come into the case in support of the voters. So that's a case to watch and to stay tuned to what happens there. I had mentioned the new restriction that's in place in Arizona. Actually, Kansas has passed the same restriction, requiring voters to show documentary proof of citizenship when they register to vote, and there's a pending lawsuit right now challenging those restrictions, and that could be decided before November as well, so it's certainly one to keep an eye on. And finally, I wanted to highlight a recent victory for defenders of the right to vote, which happened in Montana earlier this year. Voters from 3 Native communities actually sued Montana because the state had failed to create early voting locations that were accessible to these communities. And before the lawsuit could go to trial, the parties settled. And as part of that settlement, Montana agreed to establish 3 new early voting sites. And these sites will actually be open for this fall's election. So that's a great win, and in the same vein as the victory in Montana, I wanted to end things here on a positive note. I know, as well as you all know, that it can get very discouraging to see the obstacles that are being placed in front of voters. But you know, you're a group that engages voters, and I don't want to convey the message that what we're all doing here doesn't matter. There have been plenty of positive changes over the past couple of years, and as you can see from the map here, 16 states have actually expanded voting access since 2012. When I'm talking about laws that expand the vote, I'm talking about things such as what we at the Brennan Center call voter registration modernization. Those are laws that make it easier to register to vote by harnessing technology. So I'm sure you've heard about new states implementing online voter registration. That's just one example of modernizing the voter registration system, and a lot of states have put that into place. Some states have created new early voting opportunities, and you can see some of, up on your screen, some of the other positive reforms that we've seen. A lot of these reforms will be in place in November. One particular positive reform that I wanted to make sure to raise up was taking place in Oklahoma. Oklahoma actually passed 2 positive election reforms over the past couple of years. Oklahoma does have a voter ID requirement, but they actually rolled it back last year, and now they accept more IDs than they used to. So while it's still not great that they require ID to vote, they have made it easier, and they accept more documents now than they used to. Second, Oklahoma passed a law this past year that actually makes it easier for voters from Native communities there to turn in absentee ballots. Oklahoma allows you to turn in other voters' absentee ballots if those voters are perhaps have difficulty traveling or they don't have access to transportation. But Oklahoma puts an upper limit on how many ballots you can turn in for someone else. This past year, they passed a law that actually waives that upper limit for voters who are turning in ballots from tribal lands. So it makes it easier for more absentee ballots to get counted and get cast. So what's the takeaway message as we head into this year's election season? As you know, groups that care passionately about protecting the vote, I think it's obvious to all of us that our work is cut out for us. But looking at all the positive reforms that we've seen over the past few years and looking at all the victories for voting rights in courthouses around the country, I think it's most obvious that change is possible and is really achieved through working together. So I'm so happy to be here to talk with you all today. The Brennan Center is so happy to be a partner in this, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm going to have Stacy give instructions again for folks who are on the phone to ask questions, and I actually have a lead-off question as well. So go ahead, Stacy.
On your control panel, you have 2 options. You can raise your hand, and that option is highlighted here in red. And you can also ask a question in the question box. So ask Jennifer a question.
So Jennifer, that was super helpful kind of framework background for folks on the phone. And I know that in the 2012 election, one of the key kind of native vote wins that we're really proud of was the work we did in partnership with non-native communities in the state of Minnesota to turn back that attempt at putting voter ID restrictions in place on voters in the state of Minnesota. I wonder if you can kind of, step back from that balance of positive and negative that you just laid out and think with us a little bit, the coordinators on this webinar right now and those watching it down the line. What are some specific things that you're seeing as being effective in the states where there are expansions, in places where efforts to restrict the right to vote are not successful? What works? What can folks on the ground do to preserve the right to vote for citizens that they're working with?
Yeah, so certainly I am aware of your guys' victory in 2012, and that is great. And you do see, although it's been rough, I think you do see some of that happening. And I think one example from just this past year is in Ohio. Ohio has had some negative laws passed, but they also fought back against some worse laws. And we saw the same thing happen in Georgia as well. There was a rollback on early voting in Georgia, or an attempted rollback, and a bunch of community groups came together to say, no, we're not going to allow you to do this. And I would say that from my perspective, the things that worked there seem to be precisely what you are talking about. If groups can come together, and it doesn't have to be that you have a ton of press power or anything like that, but I think something that is really on our side right now and is on the side of all of us who care about voting is that the media is very interested in voting. It is a huge topic right now. It's been very timely because there have been a lot of really big court decisions on it, and it is every year when we have a huge election, such as this year, it gets so much attention. So we're lucky because it doesn't take much to draw the media's attention. So I would say what groups can do to fight back is to just make your presence known. In Georgia, there was, what I guess you could term press conferences, but they were very low technology press conferences. They were just voting groups who cared about protecting this, congregating in places such as in front of the courthouse or in front of City Hall, and explaining why this wasn't okay, and showing examples of voters who would suffer from the rollback. So in Georgia, when they were attempting to cut back on certain days of early voting, there were voters who come out and who said, I have to work 2 jobs and I can't get to the polls on election day, and if this happens, I won't have any other options. So I think when folks who might not pay as much attention to elections see something like that, they can understand what that means. And I think it embarrasses lawmakers who try to do this kind of stuff, because once people see that it's hurting individual voters, it doesn't seem like such a good idea anymore. So I would just say anything you can do to try to use the leverage of the fact that the media is actually paying attention. I think a letter to the editor will probably get published because newspapers really care right now about voting. So the more you can make yourself visible, I think you will get a lot of media attention.
Super helpful, thanks.
Jeffrey has a question. He asked, is this report available online?
Yes, it is available online. The Brennan Center's website is brennancenter.org, and you can find it there under voting. I'm also happy to email it to you, Stacy, and it can be distributed, whatever's easiest, but you can certainly find it on the Brennan Center's website.
Okay, thank you.
And we will link to it on the Native Vote website as well.
Great.
Okay, no other questions at this time. We'll let the conversation flow, and if folks have questions for Jennifer after Greg's presentation, then that would be a good time to ask further questions as well. So it's my pleasure to invite Greg from 4 Directions to give you tips and strategies as you think about your election protection operation for 2014 and beyond. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Greg. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Stacy, for putting this together. As Peter just said, my name is Greg Lambrecht, and since 2008, I've been the legal director for 4 Directions and also the South Dakota statewide coordinator for Native Vote. So what I'm going to be talking about today is going to be how to set up an effective election protection program, for your tribe or in your state. And the experience that I have, I've been working on election protection now in Native communities for 12 years since the 2002 election. So I've seen a lot, both in South Dakota and beyond. I just want to share with you some of the lessons that we've learned over that time and setting up and growing our Native Vote election protection program in South Dakota and some of the other states where 4 Directions has assisted tribes. The first point I really wanted to make broadly is that election protection really is crucial, particularly in Native American communities and especially on reservations where the treatment of people is often different because of the relationship with the state or the poor state of that relationship. And it's really important to have these election protection efforts be nonpartisan. Sometimes people will say, well, the Democratic Party comes in or the Republican Party comes in and they have people in the polling places and they have lawyers on the ground. Why do we need something of our own? And the answer is that partisan campaigns can be effective in election protection, but they often have agendas that go beyond and are sometimes contrary to the basic idea of making sure that every citizen is allowed to vote and that his or her vote is counted. So it's important for particularly Native communities to have nonpartisan, community-based election protection. And I've also found that those are most effective in encouraging voting among local people and making the voting experience a pleasant experience, one that people feel good about and don't feel intimidated by, and don't walk away saying, I'll never do that again. Really feel empowered. And maximizing participation among the community is something that can really increase the political power of the tribes, as we've seen in South Dakota and beyond. I've unfortunately personally witnessed harassment and intimidation against voters in and around polling places, and also some illegal attempts to disenfranchise voters, including by partisan lawyers and poll watchers in polling places. And those sorts of efforts not only deprive the affected voters of their vote and their voice, but also have a tendency to discourage the entire community from participating in the process. The people who are there in the polling place that see that, the people in the community who hear about that, even if they aren't there, are less likely to want to go to the polls in that election or future elections if they hear that their fellow citizens are being intimidated or harassed. In addition to the what I'll call the intentional discrimination, there's also a number of occasions where confusion and misunderstandings can result in an individual not being allowed to vote or their ballot not being counted, and that can have the same sort of negative impact upon the voter's experience. So an effective election protection program can and should address both the bad intentional mistreatment and disenfranchisement of voters, as well as I said, the confusion and misunderstandings and mistakes that can just as easily deprive voters of their rights. Stacy, if we can go to the next slide. Just wanted to briefly describe some of our experience with 4 Directions in doing this work. 4 Directions started in South Dakota in 2004, and it was largely the group that worked with the tribes during the 2002 election, which saw unprecedented and record-breaking Native turnout on the South Dakota reservations, and actually, is one of the instances where the Native vote clearly swung a statewide election in that Senate race that year. And having seen the power of the Native vote in that election, and also the importance of having an ongoing GOTV and election protection operation by the tribes and for the tribes, I was part of a group that started 4 Directions back then, and we've now been going for a decade. We've been a partner with NCAI Native Vote since 2008. We've assisted tribes and states throughout Indian country with everything from voter registration to early voting to lobbying to media, GOTV, election protection, obviously, and also litigation, which is sort of an extension of our election protection. And the Wandering Medicine versus McCullough lawsuit up in Montana that Jennifer mentioned actually was a 4 Directions lawsuit that was successful in expanding Native voting in Montana. And we've also had some litigation in South Dakota that was also resolved in an early stage with a settlement to expand early voting opportunities on reservations there. So early voting has really been a place where we've made a lot of progress in the last few years. 4 Directions has an extensive network of lawyers, tribal officials, community leaders that are all committed to increasing and protecting the Native vote in their communities. One of the main things we do is provide training for lawyers, law students, and non-legal volunteers in poll watching and election law to get volunteers ready for Election Day so they can be a resource in communities and in polling places to help voters. And then obviously we coordinate a very large legal team over several states on Election Day, and we usually have 40 to 50 lawyers and law students in South Dakota alone. So we put together a pretty big team on Election Day that's really out and in all of the major polling places on most of the reservations. Stacy, you can go to the next slide. So what I wanted to do here today was focus on what in my mind are 6 keys to developing an effective election protection program. The first is to recruit and train volunteers. The second is to engage and educate the community. The third is to effectively distribute resources. The fourth is to make sure that volunteers are prepared to address the problems that are inevitably going to come up on Election Day. The fifth is to have experienced lawyers to supervise, advise, and react to problems. And the sixth is gathering data, both for use in this election and also to help plan for future elections. So Stacy, if we could go to number 1. Thank you. The first is the recruiting and training volunteers, and this can, this is the sort of thing, if you don't do step 1, the rest of the steps, won't matter, because if you don't have volunteers and the bodies to put in the communities and put in polling places, you have nothing. So volunteers can be lawyers, they can be law students, they can also be interested non-lawyers. The basics of election law, poll watching, and voter rights are not particularly difficult to understand. And as I've said, give me a smart person who's interested, and within 45 minutes to an hour, I can basically teach them what they need to be an effective election observer and a voter advocate in a polling place for their particular state, in just that 45 minutes to an hour. Training is important because even lawyers, even experienced lawyers who don't know election law and procedures need training. So all volunteers really need training, and election law and procedures often vary quite a bit from state to state. So training really needs to be tailored to the particular state that the volunteer is going to be working in. So, for example, we have as a sample on the Native Vote website the 4 Directions Native Vote South Dakota Voter Rights Guide and Election Protection Training Manual. But if someone were to take that and try to use it in a different state, there'd probably be significant variations both in the law and also just the procedures in the polling place. So it's very important to make sure that training is specific to the state where people are going to be working. To that end, there's lots of various election law resources on a state-by-state basis that are available online. Most state Secretary of State websites or a similar, whatever the election official is, chief election official for the state, usually their website will have a lot of resources about election law and procedures. Also the ACLU, the Lawyers Committee, the Brennan Center, and a number of other voter advocacy groups have information on their websites and oftentimes have overviews of state election law, or at least articles and studies that highlight major issues that are likely to cause problems on Election Day in particular states. Stacy, why don't we go to number 2? Once you have your volunteers and you're setting up a program, it's really important to get out and engage with the community and educate the community about voter rights and the work you're going to try to do with election protection. In addition to getting people registered to vote and making them aware of the issues in the election and where their polling place is, letting them know what their rights are. And I find there's a lot of myths out there in a lot of Native communities about who can and can't vote, what the procedures are, how much trouble there could be at a polling place, and putting some of people's minds to rest often can go a long way to getting them to take the step from just registering to actually showing up and casting their ballot. So voter awareness and voter education are really important. It's also crucial in an election protection program to work with tribal officials, community leaders, local groups to really get the word out to their membership and to people they have influence over about the importance of voting and the importance of participating in the ways in which the efforts to protect the vote are going to help make sure that people are able to go to the polling place, cast their ballot, have it counted. One thing that Jennifer referred to that I echo wholeheartedly is establishing contacts with local media is really important. There's I think more so than certainly 10 years ago, the media has a real interest now, both locally and nationally, in talking about election issues, and not just candidate A versus candidate B, but also the mechanics of the election and who's allowed to vote and who isn't and under what circumstances. So reaching out to the media to let them know what you're doing and bring any issues that you foresee to the forefront can be really helpful. And then, as I'll talk about later, having those contacts can be important on the eve of Election Day or on Election Day itself if you really need to get the word out about a problem or draw attention to some irregularities that you're seeing in polling places. Oftentimes, tribes or community groups will have GOTV or other pre-election activities, voter registration drives, rallies, etc. I always find it's nice to include a voter rights or election protection component into that, even if it's just a handout, just to let people know what their rights are in the polling place. What are the things they can do? What are the things that they have legal protections from? But I think the big thing to get out as you're engaging, educating the community is if you're going to have trained volunteers in the polling places to assist voters and help protect their rights, let voters know that. Make them aware of that. Because I've actually seen with a lot of voters, voters that knew there was going to be, a lawyer or a law student who was trained, who was going to be there on Election Day, who could, help them and advocate for them if there was a problem. Has really helped to ease the mind of a lot of voters who were otherwise nervous about voting. If we can go to 3, Stacy. Thank you. The third is distribution of resources, and that's, no matter how large your team is, it could always be bigger, and you're never going to ever have enough resources to do everything you'd like to do. So making the best use of your limited resources, particularly in terms of volunteers, is a challenge, but it's certainly a challenge that has to be met. So it's important to plan in advance. Make sure that volunteers know the community and the polling place where they're going to be assigned. They can visit it and familiarize themselves beforehand. Actually go in the polling place. If they're going to be using a cell phone that day, make sure that they have reception, maybe a place to charge their phone. If they're not going to be relieved at any point during the day in terms of a shift, so they can get food that they maybe have someplace local that they know they can make a quick run to get some food or drink when they need it without being absent from the polling place too long. The more that volunteers can know in advance where they're going to be and how it's going to work on the ground, the better. An important priority in terms of where to place volunteers is, logically, in the polling places with the most voters or the most native voters, but also to the extent that native voters have had problems in certain polling places in the past, those are also high priority polling places. So for example, there's certain communities in South Dakota where it's sort of a mixed community, or it's on the border between the reservation and off reservation, and we've actually found that sometimes those are the most troublesome polling places because you have more of a mix of voters. So those we always make sure that we cover because there have been problems in the past. Also, just think about the logistics to certain polling places. If they're larger and have multiple precincts voting there, maybe there's multiple rooms or at least multiple tables, and it might be too much for one volunteer to cover the entire polling place. And also, if volunteers are not able to work all day, it's important to think about, when are the most important hours to cover, or are you able to get relief, have people work in shifts so that you can make sure that you have the coverage there when you need it. Stacy, we could maybe move on to number 4. Thank you. Another really crucial step is to be prepared for problems on election day and make sure that the volunteers are in place, ready to assist voters, interact with election officials, and deal with the problems that they're going to face. Because otherwise, election day can be a very overwhelming experience for volunteers. The first rule of election protection is to try to work with the precinct election officials on the spot to resolve any issue, because any other process, if it involves making a phone call, having the voter wait, trying to wait for reinforcements to arrive, and potentially having to go to court at some point, all of those things are really time-consuming. Voters oftentimes need to get back to work or just need to leave, and you also, while that's going on, either the volunteer, him or herself, is not focused on other voters, or the line is being held up, which can also help to decrease turnout and make for a bad experience for voters. It's important for volunteers to get to the polls before they open, to make sure that everything is set up so that voting can begin on time, that all the necessary voting officials and voting equipment is in place, and so that, any problems can be addressed either before the polling place opens or as soon as possible, so that once voters start showing up, everything can run as smoothly as possible. It's also, I've found over the years, for our volunteers to, in the early morning, when things tend to be a little slow, to really engage with the precinct election officials. Let them know that you're there to help voters, that you're there to ensure a smooth, fair process. show them that you're there to be cooperative, to be respectful, and try to make it almost like you're there to help them, as opposed to making it oppositional, where you're there to make their job more difficult. And oftentimes, the most effective volunteers, the ones that really win over the election officials, and the election officials, when issues come up, end up looking to our volunteers more often than not to say, well, what do I do now? Which is great. And then our volunteers, can then, be ready with the right answer and don't even have to step in and advocate for the voters because the election officials are actually looking to us. Really important for volunteers to sort of stand out so that people in the community, when voters show up, they know that there's someone there to protect their right to vote and who they can go to as a resource if they have questions or need help. So in the past, NCAI has done a great job of helping to distribute at low costs for operations such as For Directions and other local native vote groups, the buttons, T-shirts, etc. And that's really great because that way people step in and see a volunteer. Oftentimes, for Directions, we have lawyers from New York, D.C., L.A., San Francisco who, don't really look like they belong in that polling place in the middle of a reservation. But, when people see the native vote T-shirt or the native vote button, they understand, this is someone who's actually here to help me, not someone who's here to try to keep me from voting. Important to have either a working cell phone or make sure that volunteers know where the nearest payphone is or how they can access a phone if they need to call for backup or call to report a problem. Also, volunteers need to make sure to bring any of their training manuals, forms, pens, food, etc. that they're going to need during the day. And that's particularly true for volunteers that are going to be there for the entire time polls are open. Stacy, maybe we'll go to the next slide. Sorry, the one before that? Perfect. Because when problems come up that can't be resolved on the spot, you're going to need, volunteers are going to need to be able to reach out to the county auditor or whoever the other local election official might be. And sometimes the issue is as simple as, this person, we can't find this person's name. Are they in the wrong polling place, or are they just not on the ballot and just not on the rolls? So a lot of volunteers say they actually spend a good chunk of the day on the phone with the county auditor just getting stuff resolved. So that's something that people need to be prepared to do. So it's important for them to have the contact information for the county and state officials, as well as the local supervisor or coordinator with the election protection program. If they need any advice, they need to escalate a problem to that level. Also important, and this is part of the data collection that I talk about later, but volunteers document their activities, particularly any major incidents, but not at the expense of protecting voter rights. So, it's, you want to sort of make sure you have the data you need to document the incident and provide evidence later, but not at the expense of, of having other voters that need your help not be able to receive it. Something I always tell voters is to trust their instincts in the polling place. If something seems wrong, if it seems like someone is wrongfully being denied the right to vote, something probably is wrong and they should speak up. And volunteers need to be comfortable speaking up when there's a problem. So Stacy, why don't we go to the next slide? I just wanted to quickly go over just some of the common problems that we see on Election Day. ID issues. There's so many different laws state to state that have changed with regard to ID over the past couple of years. And as Jennifer referred to before, sometimes an ID law issue has been in the news and the people working the polling place don't necessarily know what the state of the law is. And sometimes they're asking for ID or certain forms of ID that aren't required. And that's something that can really be discouraging to voters. and cause people to be wrongfully turned away. Someone's name missing from the rolls, either because they're in the wrong polling place, or maybe they've changed their name, or they registered under a different name before they got married or something like that. We see that all the time. Inactive registration or purges, where someone hasn't voted in a few elections, or for whatever reason has been purged from the rolls. That can really be a major issue on Election Day. One issue that we see quite a bit in South Dakota is people's names get removed from the rolls if they requested an absentee ballot, regardless of whether they returned it. And some people didn't even realize that they requested an absentee ballot because they had requested one for the primary, perhaps, and it was just assumed by the county auditor that they were also going to be having an absentee ballot for the general election, and then their name is removed. Felon voting, I think Jennifer referred to a couple of states that have changed those laws, and that's something that people need to be aware of, particularly in those states where after serving their sentence, felons are eligible to have their voting rights reinstated. That's something that communities need to know about, and also volunteers need to be aware of. People who've changed their address or where their polling place has been changed since the last election tend to be an issue. Improper challenges to voters and other forms of harassment, I wouldn't say those are common problems, but when they do come up, they're very very troubling and really need to be dealt with. I've been a part of a number of situations, both firsthand and also where I've been advising, where tribal police and other officials have had to be called in to deal with often partisan poll watchers that were really resorting to illegal intimidation tactics to try to discourage voters from voting or get people to leave the polling place. Then you also just have some logistical problems. The polling place runs out of ballots, or the machine breaks down, and to have volunteers sort of know what to do and who to call to get those problems resolved quickly, so that voters don't get discouraged and leave, or the line doesn't build up too long in the interim. Stacy, why don't we move on to number 5? While I said almost anyone can be a volunteer, it is important, I found, in an election protection program to have at least 1 or 2 experienced lawyers to sort of supervise the volunteers, to advise them, and also to be able to react to any major problems. Sometimes these supervisors or coordinators can just be available by phone throughout the day to, if there's a problem that you can't solve or you need some backup, give a call. And, I've been in that role before, where sometimes there's just so many problems at one particular polling place that, I just end up having to go to the polling place myself to try to get it resolved. And these, senior lawyers need to be able to escalate problems, whether it be calling the county or state election officials, whether it be, the ability to even file a lawsuit that day if necessary, also contact the media, whatever it's going to take to sort of get that problem resolved effectively and efficiently. For particularly the folks who are going to be leading these efforts, it's crucial to have a relationship with the county and state officials in advance. That way on Election Day, they know who you are, you know who they are, and that can really make things go much easier in the chaos of Election Day. Make sure you have the right contacts with tribal government and community leaders so that if there's any problems, they can help resolve that day. We've had issues where, there was sort of, there was a lot of traffic where people couldn't get to a polling place because there was some road construction going on the morning of Election Day, and we were able to work with the tribe to basically get them to, to reopen the road to let voters through so they could get to their polling place. And, if we didn't know who to call and we didn't have the right contacts, that might have taken, an hour or more, but really it ended up being a 10 or 15-minute thing that didn't end up having much of an adverse impact. That's just one example, but you can see other ways in which it would be good to just sort of have the local officials and local law enforcement know about your effort and be there to help when they can. And again, it's really valuable to have good media contacts. If there's anything illegal going on that day or just irregular going on that day, sometimes the media getting involved can really encourage officials at the statewide level or even locally to, to really make sure that they prioritize fixing a problem. And finally, Stacy, let's go to 6. And 6 is gathering data, and it's really important to gather as much data as you can and get reports from each precinct so that problems can be documented. If there is evidence and witnesses that are going to be needed to in a subsequent challenge or a litigation or anything else, that you have that preserved, that you have names, phone numbers, times, and exact recollections. Also, future efforts can really benefit when coordinators are figuring out, okay, where do we put our resources for the next election and what kind of problems do we want to emphasize in our training sessions. Having the data from each polling place can really be valuable in prepping for the strategy in the next election. NCAI has a number of useful forms on the Native Vote website: precinct questionnaires, incident tracking forms, major incident forms, and any of those can be either used just as they are or modified to fit your specific needs for your program. And that is all I have in terms of my prepared presentation. I otherwise just wanted to leave time for questions and also to mention that the 4 Directions Native Vote South Dakota Election Observer Training Manual and Voter Rights Guide is on the Native Vote website. If you want to either see what's going on in terms of the South Dakota program or get an idea for your own program in a different state for the types of resources that we provide in South Dakota.
Thanks so much, Greg. Really appreciate that presentation. So much good stuff there for folks to engage with. We've got a few minutes for questions before we're going to wrap up today. Stacy, do we have any questions through the online system at this point?
No, we don't.
And Greg, we'll be able to make these slides available on the website as well?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple of typos and stuff, so I'll send you a new set if you want.
Okay, that sounds perfect. Yeah, I really appreciate the, as I said at the outset, the partnership with 4 Directions and the really important work that you all are doing in some really important states for Native Vote. So we really appreciate the work that you guys are doing and having the insights through the voter guide and other things that have helped Native voters over numerous cycles and Native Vote coordinators like the folks in our network.
Yeah. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much. Just wanted to check up a couple of things before we reach the top of the hour. As you can see on your slide, our next webinar will be on September 4th. As we pass Labor Day, we'll be looking at kicking off some efforts focused on Native Vote Action Week, which you'll hear about in a few moments. And it's like pulling teeth, but we're finalizing the grant with the Ford Foundation to be able to put out community grants to support efforts out in the of Native coordinators. So we'll be giving more information about that on September 4th, if not before. You'll be receiving the registration link on that shortly. Native Vote Action Week is that last week of September. So we're holding that as we did in 2012 in conjunction with National Voter Registration Day. So from the week of September 22nd, we will be hosting Native Vote Action Week. We included in the broadcast about this event information about how to sign up for Native Vote Action Week and how to get registered for your kit. So we really encourage folks to go ahead and do that. We'll just, I think, close things out here unless there are any questions folks want to put in the comment box or raise their hand. We'll close out here by putting up our contact information and just letting you know that we appreciate the ongoing partnership with you all, and we look forward to working with you in the lead up to November to make every Native vote count. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll look forward to continuing to work with you. Thanks so much.